It has been over 50 years since a communicative approach to language teaching was introduced. Yet, even today, many English language instructors struggle with its application in the classroom. How can students learn to communicate by simply communicating? Can they effectively communicate without explicitly learning rules of grammar? The list goes on. So, it is time to confront the elephant in the English language classroom. This session aims to address this session aims to address these challenges with a practical approach, considering the classroom scenarios specific to our context. So, to begin the session, may I now invite Dr. Lal C. Professor of English, Institute of English, University of Kerala. As we all know, he is a dedicated teacher trainer and ELT enthusiast who has delivered talks at esteemed conferences such as IITFL, published numerous articles, and has co edited books in the field. Additionally, he shares his valuable insights on ELT for teachers as well as students through his YouTube channel. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Arina. I hope I'm audible enough.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, good. Thank you. And I'll share my screen. Give me a minute. Thank you. So it's communicative language teaching in practice. And why this session is for long, I think since around 2006. I have been trying to learn more about communicative language teaching. And now it is 2004, is ending. And I felt that there is need for us to look at the concept or the idea more closely, particularly from the point of view of practice. So that's why I thought it will be useful if I do a talk like this. And initially, I need to make it very clear that when we talk about communicative language teaching, it is not about English. It could be any language that we learn after learning our mother tongue. Purposes and not scholarship. That's another thing that we need to remember. You might want to learn a language so that you could study the literature in it. For example, you might want to learn Russian so that you could read Dostoevsky as he wrote it. You might not have an intention of using Russian to talk or to communicate with people who speak Russian in writing or in speaking. So there, your need is not communication, but scholarship. So your approach to learning Russian will be a very different one. It will be similar to the way we would learn, say, a language like Sanskrit or Latin or ancient Hebrew or classical Greek, which are no longer used for communicative purposes, but still people learn it so that they could read books written in these languages. So that is where we stand. We are talking about second language learning. And when the purpose is communication in real life, not in purely academic context, not in the classroom, but outside the classroom, when you want to talk to other people in the target language. And here in our case, the target language happens to be English. So I thought we will begin with a definition of communicative language teaching, which can be done by looking at the three different points that which already I have mentioned. Why do we teach that particular language? Is it for scholarship or is it for daily use? So here we agree that we are going to learn or we need to teach English for daily use. So that's the purpose. And secondly, how do learners learn it? Learning your mother tongue is done by the time you start education, perhaps. And then you will go on learning it, but that's a different way of learning. You'll be focusing more on literature, more on using that language for more advanced purposes because you already know the basics of it. In case of English or another second language, for example, Hindi in Kerala, or Tamil in Kerala, or Malayalam in Tamil Nadu, or any language for that matter, second language. These methods and the intention is communication. Certainly, the things we are going to discuss will apply to that, and we'll take these points one by one. So, why do you want to teach that particular language? So, we are here talking about second language. We are talking about the communicative need. So, the goal of language teaching. Why do you want to teach that language? Is it grammatical competence that we are aiming at? No, what is grammatical competence? Grammatical competence is the knowledge of the rules of the language, how the language works. You should be able to explain how the words are put together. You will be using a lot of grammatical terminology in doing that, which is a good thing. Having a deep knowledge about how the language works is an advanced knowledge, that a language learner will find very useful. But here again, we are another point which I should have mentioned is that it is second language learning. It is learning for the sake of communication. It is also in a kind of initial level. So that's a little bit of a problem when we talk about the Indian context, because somehow, even though we start teaching our students English from very early classes onwards, even at the degree level, even in the PG level, we find that students are still in a kind of beginner level. At least a good majority of our students are in a beginner level. That is why we are talking about this, because what shall we say, technically or ideally, all the things we are going to discuss now should be done by the time the student enters maybe high school, maybe class 7. Before that, they should have done all that. And from class 7 onwards, they should ideally be able to use English or Hindi for higher purposes, for academic purposes, for dealing with more cognitively challenging matters. But somehow, due to many factors, even in the college, you find students who are still struggling with the basics. One big reason for that is we have been looking at English as if our students are learning it for the sake of scholarship. So we are focusing more on the grammar part, more on the scholarship kind of focus. So my central argument is that if we shift our focus in in all levels, from primary level onwards. So in the primary level, we could bring a transformation. In the university level, or in the high school, high secondary school, etc., we could kind of bring our student to bridge the gap that exists now, a kind of remedial thing. So if we look at the way we teach language and review the way we teach language, perhaps in the coming years, already big changes are happening. We could attain what we intend. That is, students attain their communicative efficiency by the time they leave school, and they can do higher things with English. So now that is not the case. So that's why we have to talk about changing the way we teach English. So are we aiming at grammatical competence? What is grammatical competence? The ability to speak about the language is grammatical competence. Most of us teachers have that competence. And the one can master the rules of a sentence formation in a language, but still not be successful in being able to use the language for meaningful communication. This is a very interesting scenario. We will all know that maybe 10 years, 20 years back, our general English syllabus had a lot of literature and lot of conscious grammar learning in it. And many of the students who did their education then have higher knowledge of grammar than the present students have. This is an interesting situation. And it's also interesting to see that those high achievers in grammatical knowledge often are not good communicators also. So what we need is, we need our students to be good communicators, and that has to be resolved as quickly as possible so that they can attain grammatical competence at later phase if they so choose to do. That's an optional thing. So that is one point again. Our students have different intentions. Some of them, a few of them, might want to have advanced knowledge in English. Uh, the majority of them might want a working knowledge in English. So these two differences we need to keep in mind. And in the class, by an average, most of the learners would want to have a high working knowledge in English. And if we focus a lot on grammatical competence at that stage, we will lose out on the communicative. That is the basic issue. So again, we are still talking about why do we teach that language. Here we are talking about English. Why do we teach? It is too easy to attain communicative competence. And what is communicative competence? Communicative competence is the ability to use language in real life situations. Even if you have very high grammatical competence, you need not have this ability. So one confusion that we have to make clear at the very beginning is that you can have high grammatical knowledge, still not be able to communicate. So uh, if communication is a priority, if you're learning a language, here English, for basically for communicative purposes, and then if possible for academic purposes, then certainly our initial focus should be on um, getting our students to attain communicative competence. So that is the ability to use language in real life situations and use language for a range of different purposes and functions, not just function in the classroom to write the exam, but to go out and use the language for a range of different purposes and functions. Vary the use of language according to context and participants. This is another very important function of that will be served if we encourage students to be communicative. So, change your language according to the context, formal, informal, etc. And another important thing is, with very limited vocabulary, with very limited grammatical knowledge, also students can, or people can, a learner can communicate in the target language. So when we insist a lot on grammatical accuracy at the initial phases, those students who want only to communicate on a basic level will be left out, and a good number could be affected by that. So there are so many communication strategies, non-verbal strategies are there, and with basic kind of vocabulary and syntactic knowledge, you'll be able to communicate. So that is why, for the last several years, people say that communication is the important thing. It's okay if you communicate. Well, it is not okay if you just communicate. You have to communicate well. That's another important point. But again, I want to insist that all the students in our class might not want to communicate in an advanced level. So, in our attempt to enhance their grammatical capability, very often we kind of compromise the communicative aspect. As Irina rightly pointed out, across the world, the understanding of the process of how people learn a second language has changed considerably in the last 50 years. And communicative language teaching is partly a response to these changes in understanding. So formerly, we have heard about behaviorism, etc. People thought for so many centuries, people generally thought that language was a kind of habit formation or something that you can learn by constantly repeating it. But that is not the case. And we realized that internationally, people began to realize that in the 70s. And now we are in the 21st century. Year is 2024. And internationally, a lot of changes have happened. We initially in India, we followed the British system of highly grammar-based, highly accuracy-based a curriculum, which was there when India became an independent nation. But England and other many countries have changed their priorities. They have moved to different approaches. Somehow we still have that slightly, you might even call a colonial hangover, where we still approach language as if it was something meant for deep academic learning, even when it comes to communication. So that's why I've said that India and many countries where this understanding has been more conservative are still in the process of change to the communicative model. And that is the justification for this talk. I'm trying to avoid as much um, theoretical terms as possible. So I'll try to avoid using words like grammar, translation method, or traditional method, etc. So I'm just saying that earlier views, so the views before 70s in Europe, uh, England, US, where communicative methodology evolved, uh, focus primarily on the mastery of grammatical competence as a process of mechanical habit formation. So we also, our students often do a lot of drilling, to learn structures by heart. Good language habits are formed. This is the notion, earlier view. Good language habits are formed by having students produce correct sentences through memorization and drills, and not through making mistakes. So, in our this attitude, this approach still is very prevalent among us. That is why we need to talk about it. So we still feel that it's a very bad thing when students make mistakes. But we need to see that, we need to understand that learning happens through mistakes. We know that. We know. Much of the things that I say, you'll immediately feel that, well, these are all known facts. But what I have experienced, both as a teacher and as a research guy, supervisor, when it comes to actual encounter with the students, encounter with framing a curriculum, encounter with planning a research, we forget all those things. So that is why I'm drawing your attention to these things again. So in the existing in our parts, it's still existing, and in the system that was in existence some say 50 years ago, uh, it hasn't totally gone away anywhere. It's all linked. We don't suddenly shift to an entirely new paradigm. It never happens. It should not happen. Also, kind of mixture, one influencing the other, will always be there. So errors were considered very bad, and you know very often it was insisted that you learn your language very well and only then attempt to write or speak. So the actual use of language was expected to happen after you master the language. The knowledge of grammatical terminology was considered equal to knowledge of language. That's another very, very dangerous thing that we still have. We still have this problem when we talk about learning language. We think about learning the grammar of the language. Particularly in English, we have that. When we try to learn advocate your mother tongue to somebody, you wouldn't give a grammar book to them. But when it comes to English, we still believe that learning grammar, particularly say the parts of speech or the concord or all those things, these things certainly should be learned, but the conscious awareness of it is not a must, because all these things are there. All the grammatical things in varying degrees are there in our mother tongue as well. But when we teach this mother tongue to our uh, friends or somebody from another state who speaks another language, we never follow a grammatical approach. That is something we need to remember. Then, but why in the case of English alone we should have that kind of a tendency? So knowledge of grammatical terminology or grammatical competence is not equal to linguistic ability, the ability to use the language, particularly to speak. And what does the communicative approach do? Communicative in the communicative classroom, the skills of language skills, we know the language skills. There are the LSRW skills are there, and so many micro skills are there. All these things are acquired in the classroom, and we encourage it to happen outside the classroom as well through the direct encounter with the language. This is the important thing. So we don't wait till the student becomes very, very sure about his grammar. The very first day or very initial days of his or her class, we encourage the person to use the language in whatever way the person can. So communicative language teaching is not learning to communicate, it is learning to communicate through communication. So you encourage the person to use the language in writing, in speaking, in listening, in all the ways, and involving all the micro skills from the very early classes onwards. So that's a difference in this approach. We don't begin with grammar; we begin with communication. Language learning is a dynamic process akin to a garden growing rather than a wall being built. This is an image that repeatedly come to my mind. Very often we believe that we can teach language just as we build a wall by putting one brick on the other. And we also believe that the students in our class constitute one homogeneous whole, with each student being a brick in a larger framework. Both have a problem. One, language learning, which has so many aspects. All these aspects grow up in the student's mind in varying degrees. So it's not that you learn to write first and then you learn vocabulary and then you learn grammar, or rather you start speaking first and then you. There is no such sequence. No sequence also about which grammar item should be learned first. So through communication in the class, communicative activities in the class, the learners, the language of the learner develop in different levels in his or her mind. The same way in the class also, all the learners will not come up in the same manner. This is what we generally desire. That is what we have a system of evaluating all the students using the same rubric. So different students in our room are not like bricks. They are also like garden. One will be a creeper which will be rapidly shooting up, and there will be an old, very sturdy oak tree which will take its own time growing up, but will grow strong. So you have all these things happening. So the image of garden, both about the way language learning happens in the mind, and also the way our students are in the classroom, will be very appropriate for a teacher to keep in mind. It's not you know jigsaw pieces fitting together perfectly. Is rather a big haphazard, very difficult thing. So as we discussed in the former slide, uh, how people learn language is a very, very complicated thing. And that is why in one of his uh, talks, David Crystal once said that the, the task of a language teacher is the most, particularly a second language teacher, is the most challenging thing. It's even more difficult than neurosurgery. He said that in joke, but there's a big truth in that. We all have difficulties managing English because teaching English as a second language is indeed a big challenge and a very difficult thing. It's not as simple as you think it is. It's not the fault of our students that they don't perform. It is because we still are struggling to understand how language is learned and how we go about teaching. Anyway, it's very natural. Another point we remember in the communicative approach is that it's very natural for students to produce incorrect sentences. They have to produce incorrect sentences. Errors are essential. It's an essential part of language learning, and all errors need not be corrected in the class. So, this again comes to it kind of clashes with our existing mindset, where we say that our students do not. This is a sentence that teachers repeatedly say. Our students do not know even the letters of the alphabet. It may be true. So stop complaining and see what we can do about it. So errors are a good indication. They are signs that students are attempting to learn. So if we learn to find errors delightful in our students, our life will become much easier. This life of students also will be easier. So never worry, as an English language teacher, never worry if our students make a lot of errors. Keep on involving them in communicative tasks, and errors will be corrected in a very long-term basis. And when the error correction happens, you may not be there in your life. So we meet them for a year, 2 years, perhaps, or a bit longer in school. But you know, All you can do is to give them a healthy, happy environment to learn. And their problems, errors will be corrected over time. And you need not be there to do that all the time. And in communicative, in a communicative class, when students use language in the class to communicate, and also outside the class, if we motivate them well enough, they will correct themselves from feedback. Feedback is an important word. It's not the feedback that we take at the end of a session. When I talk to a person and I am a learner, I might use a sentence tentatively. From what I know, I might use a sentence which may not be right. And the feedback is when the person I'm talking to do not give me the right response, I understand that there is something wrong with the sentence I uttered. Maybe I'm not able to correct it, then I leave it, or maybe I will say it in some other way. But next time, I will rectify that issue when I encounter that particular structure in some other context. All these things are unconscious. We don't have to teach a person to, look for feedback, etc. All these things are for us, for teachers to have in mind. We don't go and tell the students to, look for feedback, etc. So anyway, feedback means the response you get when you attempt language. And depending on that, you keep changing. This is what happens when a child grows up and acquires a mother tongue too. The child will be using language from the structures it had listened to since it is born. All these things are, mixed up in the brain, and then as time comes, new forms, new structures are formed by the child, and he or she also perfects the mother tongue through a feedback system. He says something, he wants maybe a toy, and he says something the parent doesn't understand and he doesn't get the toy. He finds some other way to make it clear, and that is how language grows. So feedback is a very, very important thing. And in our classrooms, what children don't have is generally feedback because we don't involve them in communicative activities. CLT, communicative language teaching, depends a lot on input. This is another very important thing. Krashen's input idea, which we are all familiar with. Even if we are not, it's okay. It just says that, to become a good speaker of English, I need to have a lot of input. I need to read a lot or listen to English a lot. Without listening, without reading, I cannot be a good reader, a good writer, or a good speaker. That's a known fact, but still something we need to remember all the time. In the students learn, they become very good users of language when they could get more and more input. And what kind of input? It's not the textbook that the student learns from. It, the student learns language from real models, what they read, novels, perhaps, report somewhere, a brochure somewhere. They can learn from anywhere, from real life. And across varieties, what I meant is we don't train a student to speak British English alone or American English alone, particularly these days when language is becoming rapidly international. So the students are exposed to all varieties of language. And as much input comes in, they are more likely to use it. But input alone is not enough. You might be a voracious reader, but you may not become a good writer until you start writing. You start writing and you practice writing. And however a good listener you are, you have in your brain has all the perfect pronunciation until you start using English in the with your friends or with in real life context, you will never be a good speaker. So we need to combine both output and input. So output is something we can encourage in the class, but input is something that the student has to, do outside the classroom largely, but still we can kind of do a little bit in the classroom also, because classroom has its limits, and we need to look at classroom as not as a space where we are going to teach the students everything we know. It should be a space where the student starts learning and then go out and complete his learning. So this is something we need to remember all the time, particularly in these days when we are bound to a syllabus and we are, so many deadlines are there. We should not forget the fact that learning happens outside the classroom. Only a fraction of learning happens inside the classroom, even if it is content or if it is language that you are teaching. Well, CLT is all about trying out and experimenting with different ways of saying things. So when you follow the grammatic method, we put sentences into very rigid compartments. We say it's passive voice, active voice, reported speech, etc. Students do not get to experiment with language. We are imposing a lot of structures on them. So in communicative activities in the class, when students talk to each other, they will experiment and try out languages in a variety of ways. And that is where dynamic, holistic learning happens. And CLT is all about authentic material and realia, about which I'll be talking more in a coming slide. Excuse me. Now, what I have said so far, I have tried to create the base for discussing the practical aspect of CLT, the theoretical aspect, which we generally get in any YouTube video on CLT. The theoretical aspect is available, but I believe every English language teacher should become stronger and stronger in notions related to communicative language teaching, because communicative language teaching is a very eclectic, uh, very composite kind of thing. It's not a single method, etc. It's a kind of approach, to use that word in a very inexact way. Anyway, yeah, and we are talking about what happens in the classroom and what roles teachers and learners take in a communicative language class. In our typical classroom, even today in a language classroom, we see students as individuals, but then we see them as a whole as well. But we believe that language learning happens, separately in each individual. That is so. If you want to teach language for scholarship, certainly it's individualistic. But because communication is our focus, all the classroom activities will be collaborative. That's very, very important. So that's one thing, that fundamental thing that we need to keep in mind. It is the students talking a lot in the classroom. Maximizing student talk time is a very, very committed motto that a communicative language teacher should have. So if I go to the class, if I can get the students to talk, how as much as possible, we have attained something. Very often, if you remember, in our commitment to finish our syllabus, very often we do all the talking. Occasionally, you might ask a question which one or two students might answer. Otherwise, it's all highly teacher driven, where we talk. And our English is the only model that the learner has in that particular. But in a communicative language classroom, students will do a lot of listening, not only to the teacher, but to the other students, the class peers, when they do, they work in group or when they work in a pair. And remember, in a communicative language classroom, students are supposed to work continuously in group and pair work. Well, this is not about a literature class where the model will be slightly different. But in a language class, students should always work in pairs and groups. And the teacher's business is to frame activities in such a way that they, they do tasks using English as the medium of not medium of instruction, the medium of communication. The teacher is no longer the only model available. Learners pick up different language features from peers. Learners, again, another thing is, in this model, slowly, we feel that the responsibility of learning is the learner's responsibility. And the learner also kind of slowly understands that the responsibility of my learning is mine. It depends on how we manage the classroom, how we structure activities. Our job is not easier. Our job will be more difficult. It will be even more difficult if we want to shift to a communicative mode, but it's an essential thing. Until we shift to a communicative mode, our classes are not going to be effective for all students. It will be effective for a group of students all the time, but for a larger number, for our classes to be beneficial to a larger number of students, we need to shift the responsibility of learning to them. This is something we always say. We talk about learner autonomy, but I want us to look at it in a closer way. What I mean here is not the teacher explaining, it is the students exploring and encountering, and then through that, learning the language or acquiring the language. We again have this difference between fluency and accuracy. We often, there is always this complaint that when we focus a lot on communication, we lose out on accuracy. So there is this thought, that this fear that communicative models impair accuracy. That is not so. And as I set down in the very beginning, we follow this intensely communicative approach at a stage in the student's life when they are trying to gain confidence in using the language, and when they're attempting to become comfortable users of the language. Once they have done that, and those set of students in our classroom who have that need and who have attained that, and they are entering the university, perhaps, then you no longer have to follow any of these things because they have already become good users. Then we could shift to more academically challenging modes of teaching. That's a different thing. But basically, we will involve the students in discussions, etc. But all the things we say now in this particular talk is about what we will do to the learners in their initial years with English. So as I said, initial years could be in class 3 to 5, but in the present scene, sometimes it could be adult learners who come to us for instruction. They're kind of beginners in their own way. And we will work with them intensely in a communicative manner for the first few months, and then maybe we'll shift our more to a deeper, more literature-based teaching. So grammatical competence is surely needed to produce grammatically correct sentences. We are not advocating incorrect use of language. We are only saying that our insistence on grammaticality in the initial stages, that is a stage where we are very often in the school or the degree class, should not impair the students' confidence to use the language. Focus on the ability to use language appropriately for different communicative purposes, such as making requests, giving advice, making suggestions, describing wishes, negotiating, arguing, defending. All those things that a person will need to do in actual life is what we should be focusing on, rather than the person being able to produce exact, precise, well-trimmed sentences. Our students need initially to use the language for all these functions. So that's why we talk about a functional syllabus and functional grammar, etc. Functional grammar is not a kind of different thing. It's the grammar that we know, but it's administered in a different way. We will come to that. A CLT class is activity oriented. This is something we know. We constantly talk about activity-based teaching. But sometimes we get the word activity wrong. I remember an instance when during a training program, students were asked to do an activity for about 5 minutes, ending in something, and the students did something with paper, tearing newspapers and rolling them, etc., etc. Not a single word was produced during that 5 minutes. No English was produced. They were creating something using paper. So that is not what we mean by activity. There could be a lot of physical activity, etc., to enthuse the students, to get their energy level, and all is fine. But when we talk about activity in communicative language classroom, we mean language activity. An activity in which the students are likely to use English or the target language in a very normal context. So that is, we need to have a very clear idea about what activity is. A teacher's business is to frame activities, particularly when we are talking about the communicative class. Our business is to frame activities, plan a class in which there will be a series of activities. Maybe you get 45 minutes. And it is through these activities that hour's transaction is done. So in an activity-based classroom, we look at what happens. So the teacher plans in advance, keeping in mind the levels and interests of the learners. Only the teacher knows that particular class. And every class is different. Every year is different. Teachers often say that this batch is better than that batch and that batch was better, etc. It's rather immature on our part to think like that, because that is human. Every group of people, every new class will have a different dynamics, because we have a totally unique combination of individuals. It's bound to have its challenges, bound to have its beauty. So we don't have a batch being better than the other batch. It is our approach that should adapt accordingly. And so when you frame activities for a batch, what I do for my students in a particular college might not be suitable for another teacher in another college. That is why a fixed syllabus will not work very well for all. But we have to do that. Standardizing, uh, uniformity, all are essential. We could have a fixed syllabus, but a teacher could adapt the syllabus according to the learners in that particular socio-economic or whatever context. And when we frame an activity, these are the things we need to keep in mind: information gap, choice, feedback, and authentic material. We look at them one by one. Information gap. So I'll give an example. Some 40 years back, a neighbor was doing a spoken English class for some students. I was then a student myself, and we used to work together preparing material for the spoken English class that he was doing. I've never actually seen him doing it, but I've helped been with him. So what we would do is we would uh, develop a conversation, for example, between a shopkeeper and a person, a bank employee and a customer, etc. We'll have all the things that should go into the conversation on that sheet of paper, which will be photocopied, and students will be role playing. So one person will pretend to be the shopkeeper, the other person will pretend to be the customer. Each will have the same script, and they'll be kind of reading it out to each other. And at that point in history, as I was saying, this must be the early 80s. This was the way we conceived teaching communicative. You have a fixed, all we assume that when they study all these different sentences, they will be using that in different contexts. Well, rather than not having a communicative attempt at all, that is good, but that is not. The problem with that script is that two people are having the same script. They know exactly what question is coming and what to go. There is no actual challenge involved. Unless you happen to be a very, very motivated learner, it's not going to help us. And it is not really communication, it is actually reading out. So, what is needed? One thing we need to remember all the time is that our students are very complex individuals. We may sometimes say that he's a low achiever, he doesn't know English. But remember, he might have faculties that are amazing. So they have many, many faculties which we generally do not see in the class. Students are very, very complex, very intelligent human beings. Every individual is mostly like that. And such a person to wholeheartedly involve in an activity should have a reason for that. I need to feel convinced that I should do it. Only then only when I have a reason to do something, only when I have a reason to ask a person a question, will I really, really commit. Simply because it's there in the paper. So, uh, what is the rate of interest today? So that question, I know the other person knows that answer, and the other person is expecting that question. This is not communication. So there is no information gap. So in an information gap activity, the two people should have totally different sets of information, and only then the the conversation really happens. It becomes communicative. It becomes purposeful. So purposefulness is a very important point we need to remember. Students or learners, adult learners, very initial learners, whatever age group may be, will involve wholeheartedly in an activity when they feel that the activity is purposeful. And to make an activity purposeful, we need to ensure that there is information gap. What is information gap? For example, you do an activity in which two students are involved. One of them have a list of grocery items, which the other person has a list of items that they want to purchase. So only I know what items are there in my shop, and the customer, only the customer knows what is there. And then when he asked me, can I have a packet of curd? Then it's not in my list. Then I would say, I'm sorry, I don't have it. So different expression, different convenient expressions like, I'm sorry, I'm afraid we don't have it. We are expecting a fresh stock to arrive, etc. Depending on the level, we'll have these structures, which could be given to the students if you like. If they are very basic level learners, we could have a list of possible beginners, list of possible expressions that we already make the students familiar, so that when they do this activity, they have enough language to fall back up. That kind of scaffolding is possible. But however, whatever, the most important thing is that there should be this gap between a gap of information, so that the actual communication happens. So this is an example for that very basic activity, but even adults find this very interesting. You have here student A. It's the program. The activity is called the day out, where somebody has gone on a walk through the countryside. The student A has one picture, student B has one picture. The student A's picture is complete. Student B has several things missing. So what will happen is student A will describe the picture to his partner. So two people looking face to face with the pictures visible only to themselves. The other person cannot see that. Those are the rules of the game, rules of the activity. So I have here, I will say that there is a windmill on the right side, on the right hill, and the birds are flying over the hill in the middle, and there's an airplane, there is a church on the left side, etc. I have to do that. And enough scaffolding is given, say, but maybe a couple of exposure activity might be done before. So the students are familiar with expressions like next to, in front of, on, in, behind, etc. So you have and we say that give a model. There's a windmill on the top of the hill in the right. So these instructions, scaffolded instructions, are there, and the student B tries to draw pictures and might ask clarification. If he doesn't understand, he or she will ask clarification. So that's a small activity which I have tried very often with different levels of learners, and always it is fun. Always there is language involved. So the student explaining and the student asking questions. And here, see the gap in information is that they are having two different sets of information with them, and they need to describe or ask for filling up the gaps. That is an example for information gap in our tasks. Second point in a communicative activity is choice. Choice is, as I said in the before, the former example, I have a grocery list and I have a choice of 5 or 6 items from, I need not use all that. So I have a choice. So choice is very important because that will create a lot of actual communication like scenario. The speaker needs choice of what to say and how to say it, because if we fix the sentences that he or she is supposed to speak, that will both become artificial, and again the purposefulness and the flexibility will be lost. So whenever we have an activity, the students should be given a lot of uh, um, space to decide where I should begin, and I should have a choice. Maybe I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do only this, etc. That choice is very important in a communicative activity. So when we frame a communicative activity, leave different choices, because a student may not be very confident with one. So he or she will always be able to take another option and then work on that. And another important thing is feedback. In a communicative activity, we need to ensure feedback. Feedback is, again, as I explained in the beginning, it's not feedback that you give at the end of a session. It is, I'll read out what I've written. A speaker needs to evaluate whether the words he spoke really conveyed the idea he had in mind. He said something, he's not sure he said it right. It's not a question of saying it right, it's a question of the other person understanding. So when the other person shakes his head or nods in agreement or gives the right response, that is the feedback. So during the activity, the listener should be given the opportunity to provide the speaker with such feedback. That is, when you set a task, you have a question, and the answer should not be a nod. The answer should not be yes or no. The answer should be a phrase at least. It's not a you need not insist that the students should speak in full sentences, because in actual life we very rarely speak in full sentences. Nods are important, shakes of hand, expressions are all important. That are all encouraged in the communicative language classroom. We don't interfere at all when the student speaks, maybe using gestures, etc. But we can gently encourage them to use language more. So feedback is that is the significance of feedback. Activity should be so structured that genuine inquiry and feedback is in it. Don't Teachers are not to worry too much about it, but the knowledge of these things are needed at the back of your head when you plan activity. Finally, I think when you plan a communicative activity, it's important to use authentic material. This is a word again often creates a bit of confusion to us. By authentic, what do you mean by authentic? By authentic, we mean not genuine. We mean things the students are likely to encounter in real life. It's important that the situations used in the activity are authentic in the sense they are real to the student. So a student at Kattapana, rural Kattapana in Idiki district in Kerala, are working, and you give them a task very suitable to urban student in Trivandrum or Cochin, where visiting a mall, it would not be authentic for them. That is what we mean by authentic. Partly, it should be real to them. It should be familiar things familiar to them. Students should not assume roles of exotic characters they cannot relate themselves with. So if you are working with students who have never heard of Cinderella and you are asking them to act as Cinderella, it wouldn't happen naturally for them. But if you ask them to act as a very familiar neighbor, they know a context very close to his or her heart, they will involve more. This is about situations. Also, material that we use. We Another dimension of authentic material is a textbook with fixed conversation, etc. is not authentic. The example I gave, the kind of material my friend developed for his class with fixed utterances, sentences, is not authentic. That's a very good example for an unauthentic material. Authentic material would be something that you encourage the speaker to use in the class, maybe a paper clip, a newspaper clip, or a brochure, or a train ticket, something that you take out from real life, maybe the car of a bottle. All those things are authentic material, which again are familiar with to the student. We don't give a London Underground ticket to a student in Gujarat, rural Gujarat, where the student knows only a bus. So appropriateness, whether a bus ticket or a train ticket will be more suitable there. So the material you use in the class, the context that we have in the class should be comfortable to the students. But again, this has another aspect to it. You might wonder, shouldn't they be exposed to cultural difference? So that's what I said. We are talking about the initial stages of learning language, the first few years or first few months in the case of adult learners. Once they become familiar, then again we'll be using authentic material. For cultural familiarities, if that is what we intend, we will use authentic material from that particular the target culture. For example, if you want to uh, um, activate students' knowledge about English culture, you will be using many realia or authentic material from English everyday life. Maybe things you download from the internet. Like that is where the YouTube map would come to relevance. When the second stage in our uh, teaching, we move to more advanced levels of cultural familiarity. But where also authentic material is very useful. Even when we are in the advanced level, material should be authentic or suitable, not prepared for the material, for the course, but taken from real life. That is what we mean by authentic material. Yeah, but these days you have many course books with preset activities which are considered authentic, and all these things are challenged. All these things have generated a lot of negative and both favorable and unfavorable uh, opinion among experts. But here, I am not advocating any of these things. I'm just saying that these are bits of information that will be very useful to teachers and bits of information that have been useful to me as a practitioner over these years. So that's the rationale behind of the stuff I am talking about, not because I think things are, revelations. Examples for authentic material: newspapers, magazines, videos, podcasts, social media posts, anything, a map, uh, advertisement, letters, email. All these things are examples for authentic material. Uh, and by realia, we mean, you take a real artwork to the class, that becomes a realia, or you take a jug to the class and develop an activity around that, or you give students boarding passes and ask them to work on it. Or the teacher gives a timetable to the student. The teacher teaches in 4 classes. She has 4 different sets of timetables. She gives them the students and asks them to compile it into a single frame. That's all reality. They are all authentic material, because those are things with which students are able to relate, and students are able to respond, and their conversation will become more natural and purposeful. And I think this is the final part of my presentation, where I talk about kinds of language activities. One very common, very useful um, communicative activity mode is jigsaw activities. Um, this also works on the information gap principle. Individuals, pairs, or groups have part of the information needed to complete an activity. The class must fit the pieces together to complete the whole. I'll give you an example. I have 4 points which a person should take care while traveling in a train long distance. I have 4 paragraphs on that. I'll get 4 different students to work on these 4 paragraphs, or different groups will work on these 4 paragraphs. So a particular group will have to work only on one paragraph, which becomes, the task is more attainable that way. Attainability is another important thing. An initial learner should be given tasks that he is able to finish at the given point of time. It should not be too daunting. Or there could be different levels. At each point, he has a feeling of completion. Anyway, here you have this chunk that 4 different groups are working on 4 different chunks. And then you mix them in such a manner that one from each will be part of another group. And each will have the responsibility of narrating what he discussed in the group to the rest of the uh, members of the group. So group reshuffling, or individually people work and then become groups and discuss it. So for the information to complete, people have to sit together and talk. That is basically what jigsaw activity is all about. Yeah, the example I gave is that you have 4 paragraphs, 4 ideas discussed in 4 groups, and then share with others, so that uh, all the um, all the information is complete for everybody. This is a jigsaw activity. And task completion activities, which are common: puzzles, games, map reading, other kinds of classroom tasks, in which the focus is on using one's language resources to complete a task. Again, this is not a single person sitting and filling a puzzle. No, that's not what we mean by a communicative activity. Task completion In a task completion activity, at least 2 students should be working on it and talking to each other. And it could be a group of 4, not more than 4. Two pair, a group 3 or 4 will be ideal, and they discuss it. So this is always discussion, always students sharing ideas, sharing opinion. They have a work to do, and they work on it using English as the language with which they complete the task. So in all these places, we are using language with a purpose. Language is used purposefully. The job of the teacher, as I repeatedly say, is going to be difficult when we try to do it, because we have to plan the activity. However well we plan, when we go to the class and try to launch it, you will find it very difficult sometimes, and sometimes it will work very well. Sometimes you'll need to adapt, and sometimes with the same group, in 2 different days, you will have 2 different experiences. So all that is part of the language teachers class. So if you don't get a good feel one day, do not worry, the next day you will get it. This is a good example for task completion. Here you have student A working on a map kind of thing. You have some buildings here. Swimming pool is there, the park is there, the market, etc. And the student A has a set of information. Same image, the student B has another set of information. He has supermarket, he has shoes, florists, etc. in the second student. So using these big images, they have a They have the task of finding out what the other person is having. So, you are the railway station and you want to change some money, you want to buy some medicine, send a large letter, it means a parcel, buy some flowers. Those are the things student A want to do, and student B wants to do all these things. And they have two different sets of information, and they work on it and they complete the task. In the course, they'll be speaking, asking, uh, where can I change some money? The students say at the bank, it is next to the whatever, and it's behind, it's beside. And we are scaffolding by giving them those words as prompt. So when they initially speaking, and then we can also ask them to create a draft of all these things, and then you can go further if you like. So uh, information gathering activities in which students go about talking to other students and collecting information, surveys, interviews, and students together searching the net and gathering information. All these things are good communicative activities, very result oriented. Information transfer activities, uh, taking information in one form, as I told you a while ago, like the timetable. You have the teacher's timetable she uses in different classes where the student puts together a description transformed into a graph, etc. Information transfer activities, where we often talk about having a small story which is put in the form of a drama, or a drama put in the form of a story. All these things, again, not done individually, but in, in pairs or groups. Then it becomes communicative. Role playing, uh, reasoning, gap activity, etc. Now, I need to have more time on a few other things, so I'm cutting that short. So, why do students work in pairs and groups? When students work in pairs and groups, they get ample listening and speaking practice for all the students. Normally, in a class, it is the teacher talking all the time, and a few students might give some response. But in a communicative class, students will be working almost uh, 80% of the class in pairs and groups. So they have a lot of opportunity to speak and listen and read and write as well in actual communicative context. And a greater amount of language than would a lot of language will be generated, and the motivation level will be high. When the students are not familiar with these kind of activities, when the teacher is not familiar with this kind of activity, there will be problem initially. But once they get the hang of it, this is going to work remarkably well in the classroom. These are all proven things. And I am now speaking about it after trying this. I've seen it tried in many contexts, in different levels, from very initial learners up to adult learners. And I can guarantee you that it works remarkably well. Yes. And in a CLT classroom, we don't say that this today's class is on reading. It could be on reading. The focus will be on reading skills, but there will be some bit of conversation among the students where they'll be talking. There will be some note taking, some little draft being prepared and things. Though much of the time it will be uh, reading, if your focus is on reading. So there is a large amount of skill integration in the CLT class. It's not either writing only or speaking only or listening only. It's all the things happening together because, as I said, like a garden, language grows from different aspects and different paces. And as I mentioned before, the student talk time is more important. If the student's talking to people sitting nearby, that is communication. Not a student standing up in the class and talking to the rest of the students, or the student talking to the teacher. That is not exactly communication. Communication is when students talk to one another or to each other in groups and pairs. The teacher talk time should be as limited as possible. Teacher gives instructions, and the teacher monitors, teacher kind of supervises. Teacher is in charge. She is totally in charge. She's a big resource in the class, but she or he will try to keep teacher talk time as limited as possible. Yeah. So CLT classroom, and now we come to the final aspect of my talk. Again, I am repeating this final aspect again, where I am trying to address a question that teachers repeatedly worry about. Shouldn't we be teaching grammar? Should grammar be done away with? Well, I'm saying you should know when to teach grammar, how to teach grammar, and how much to teach grammar. When do we teach grammar? Language, grammar is all about language. Every utterance you make, every gesture you make, every sound you make has a grammar behind it. So you need not overtly be conscious of that. Explicitly, you need not deal with grammar. We should stop believing that when we teach English, we are trying to teach the students the what do you call it, parts of speech. The student should be conscious about a noun, should be conscious about an adjective, etc. That they should know where an adjective should be used, but they need not necessarily know that it is an adjective. That knowledge is something the teacher should have. That is the teacher's grammar. The teacher's grammar tells the teacher that I'm going to instruct the students in Concord today. But we don't tell the students that students we are going to do work on Concord today, particularly if they are the early learners. In your advanced English language class, you can afford to do whatever you like. You can talk about theoretical grammar, anything can be done. But in the basic grammar class, which most of us are dealing with all the time, don't mix teachers' grammar with students' grammar. Students should know how to use language well. The teacher should have the knowledge about how the language works and all the terminology. Keeping that in mind, we frame activities in such a way that the students get a lot of practice in the language. So, so you should know when to teach and how to teach and how much to teach. Too much grammar, giving them information about grammatical items which they are never going to encounter in their life is something we can avoid. But for the UPSC exam or for many tests, students will be asked very complex grammar questions that they are supposed to learn later. You need not do that in your basic English language class. If you focus on constructions like the future perfect, continuous, etc., much of the students will lose out on. So how much, most often our students will have problem with the basics like using had, for example, or the present perfect or the present continuous. All these things are again teachers' terminology. We are not going to give the students the knowledge that I am using a present perfect sentence. He should be able to use a present perfect sentence, but he need not identify it until he has become very comfortable in using the language, when grammatical terms will not become a hindrance to his learning itself. That is one point we need to remember. In particular, in the Indian context, often students do not communicate in English because they are worried a lot about theoretical grammar and grammatical terminology. That is why we should change our approach. Well, grammar is there all the time, and there are mechanical ways of teaching grammar, meaningful ways of teaching grammar, and communicative ways of teaching grammar. And in fact, all mechanical, meaningful, and communicative activities can be given. And I need to acknowledge at this point that I'm relying heavily on Jaxie Richards' work on CLT. He has done extensive work. There are so many YouTube videos there, Jaxie Richards. There are so many people I respect a lot over time. I consider them as teachers who have taught me directly or indirectly. So this particular, much of the slides in this presentation are based on the book, the name of the book I'll share at the end. So he talks about mechanical, meaningful, and communicative, which I thought are very interesting words. We need not remember it, but the idea is what I want. So in mechanical practice, this is what we traditionally would do. We say that today I'm going to do superlative adjectives with the superlative adjectives usually appear before the noun they modify. You're using many technical terms, you're modifying, using superlative, etc. And then we give example. The funniest person I know is my friend Bob. The most caring individual in our class is the custodian, etc. And these sentences are from a book I've taken as such. I'll tell you the name of the book later. In our classes, we would be using expressions, names, etc., which our students are comfortable with. That is where the authenticity comes in. So we also say that superlatives are often followed by relative clauses in the present perfect. There is nothing wrong in this kind of thing. Mechanical practice is needed sometimes. There's nothing wrong in that. But only thing is, in our communicative classroom, if we do this, the students are likely to be slightly intimidated by this terminology, and they will equate the knowledge of terminology with knowledge of language, and they will have a problem with that. So we would use this perhaps with advanced learners once they have mastered language very well, and a group of students want to have knowledge about the language on a higher level, English major students doing a grammar paper, perhaps you could do this. But for the other learner, you can avoid all the terminology. You can say that complete the sentence with your own information and add more details and compare with a partner. One of the most inspiring people I've ever known is, that's one model that has worked out. And the example is one of the most inspiring people I've ever known is my math teacher. She encourages students to think rather than just memorize formulas and rules. She's a communicative equivalent uh, among math teachers. And the students are encouraged to work on more models. A model is given. The terminology is not there, but the model is given, which they work on. Maybe they'll take some time looking at this. Again, is not for very early learners, and then they engage in the uh, in similar constructions. So we are keeping terminology out. And in a communicative practice, we go a level further, right? At least, after A will be there, this will be there initially, and then we go to a more communicative phase where we say write at least 5 sentences using the words below: brave, honest, interesting, smart. Here, students are asked to come up with sentences from their own life. In the previous one, contextual, it was contextual, but not related to the person's life. Here, you are making it very, very real to them. So they pick up people from their own life and then engage in the same construction. Uh, so, see here, for example, the communicative aspect comes in. One student says, "My next door neighbor is the bravest person I've ever met." And another student asks, what did your neighbor do exactly? She's a firefighter. Once she saved a child from a burning building. So here, a grammatical term, and then you have a discussion around it, a few more exchanges around it, making more organic, making it more real. So here, I'm not saying that in the early level itself you're going to do this. This is an example for when we deal with adult learners, perhaps, or college level learners, where you want them to have knowledge in advanced grammar and you want to keep terminology out. This is the way you will be looking at it. And um, to sum up all the things I have been trying to say, language learning is a gradual process. So very often teachers want quick results. Students want quick results. That's why they say they go from one course to the other, seeking to improve their communication skills. Very often people come asking to teachers, which course shall I take to improve my spoken skills? Or which course shall I take to improve my written skills? No course can work wonders unless your student is willing to sit and work on it. Even if you are willing to sit and work on it, language learning happens slowly. It is organic, it takes time. So don't rush. Take all the right decisions, do all the right things, and go on doing it. Language will come. Language learning is a gradual process that involves creative use of language and trial and error. So we often think trial and error is not a good method, but in language teaching, in life, we learn naturally like that. In language, we make mistakes and get feedback, and then you change. And in its creative use of language. In groups, you creatively use language and learn. All the errors are normal product of learning. The ultimate goal of learning is to be able to use language both accurately and fluently. So even though I seem to say that grammar is not needed, ultimately our aim is to the students, those students who need it at least, should go towards grammatical accuracy. So in every class, though, as I said, 80% will be students working, and of that, 10% can be set aside for accuracy-based activities, need-based. So when and what should you teach? So you do a task in the class, you find that students repeatedly have a few particular problems. Pick one of them and do 10 minutes on that. So that is an accuracy part in your class, again, without kind of challenging the students' confidence. Um, language, yeah, they seek to develop students, seek to develop students' communicative competence through linking grammatical development to the ability to communicate. So it's not doing away with grammar. It's not doing away with accuracy. It's blending communicative skills with that. Hence, grammar is not taught in isolation, not taught explicitly, Grammar, your aim is not to teach grammar. Your aim is to teach language, and grammar is something you keep in mind, but raises out of the communicative task, and thus creating a need for specific items of grammar. Student might carry out a task and then reflect on some of the linguistic characteristics of their performance. This all might happen, but in different levels. This is applicable to the beginner and to the advanced learner, to the young learner, to the adult learner. Only thing is that the topics we choose will be different. And this is, we are coming to the end of my presentation. A couple of observations. We should always remember that today we are dealing with very large numbers of students, in the sense that there 40 years ago, when we had a more grammar-based teaching, the people who wanted to learn English was relatively fewer in number. Today, larger sections of the society needs language. Though even those who do not go to a school or college wants to learn the language so that they can use it for livelihood, going abroad, working with people from other countries, etc. So we are talking about a large group of learners. And not all of them want to be specialists. That is where I want us to keep in mind all the time. That is why I am saying that we should not worry a lot about grammatical accuracy in the class, because only a few of them would want to be specialists. And those students who will be writing UPSC exam later on in their life will practice on their own and create sentences like, by the time I do a talk next year, you will all have been, etc., etc. That kind of complicated sentences is meant for those students who want to be special. Or initial, the learners who want fluency uh, are the larger majority. That's the aim. I'm saying accuracy is certainly our aim, but fluency is the way towards accuracy. So if you're overtly focusing on accuracy, fluency is never attained. Grammatical competency models assumed homogeneous learners. So the former models we had, and the model we still, that the model that still haunt us in our classes, that focus on grammatical competency, which assumes that all the learners are homogeneous, all their needs are homogeneous. That's not the case. And again, we also thought that language is a monolithic thing. Language is not monolithic. Language is constantly changing. And for different purposes, we need different kinds of language, whatever language we are talking about. And finally, no single method. So even though I have said many things, sometimes the old translation method, doing a bit of translation in the class, doing a bit of traditional grammar teaching will come handy. So it's all up to the teacher's discretion. Only thing is, we should have all the notions right. And then there is no limit, no single method to teach English. There could be, so particularly at this point of time when we talk about post method, etc., it's the teacher who decides what is the right method in the class, but he or she should be governed by all the things that we have discussed until now. And these are the references that I'd like to give you. Communicative Language Teaching Today by Jack C. Richards is a book that you can download from his website. So it's a small, relatively small booklet, about hardly 50 pages. And I'm using that for this particular presentation. I was drawing heavily on Jack C. Richards' book, which can be downloaded. So it was a bit 2006, but much hasn't changed since then, though experience have changed.